The experience I'm sharing with you is one that has made me have a completely different perspective on life and death. I had travelled out of town for an interview. It was for a job that, if I would have got it, would have required myself to relocate. A role I really wanted in a field I was passionate about. At the time I didn't drive, so the quickest way for me to get where I needed was to get the train. Well, multiple trains, as it was a 2.5-hour journey from where I lived. There was no straight route from A to B. I could only get a journey with stop-off and switching trains. The journey there in itself was fine. No hassle, and everything ran smoothly and on time. The interview itself, well, I felt looking back it could have gone better. It had been a long and tiresome day, and having set out early, I'd been out all day, with just wanting to get home and think back over my interview. I'd reached the halfway point where I'd exited one train and switched platforms waiting for the last train on the final leg of the journey. It was nearing midnight, and like I said, I just wanted the journey to be over and get back home. Reaching the platform, I looked around to see it was deserted. But what could I expect with having such a late train journey? So taking a seat, I sunk into the chair, looking out into the darkness of the night. As I sat there, thinking, the silence was broken by a sound that caught my attention. Now, I don't know what it was, but it sounded like a person. Sitting up, I looked around to see where the sound had come from. But as I looked around and scanned the area, there was no one in sight, and again, there was just silence. Tired, I thought maybe I was just hearing things. Sitting back on my seat, I looked up at the schedule. The train I needed was due any minute, and like clockwork, it seemed to be on time, as I could hear it in the distance. Standing up, I stepped forward, waiting on the platform for it to arrive. It was then my ears pricked again as a sound echoed from beside me. Out the corner of my eye, I saw someone enter the platform. Turning to face them, I could see it was a woman. She was crying. The platform was empty a minute before, deserted, so where had she come from? She didn't walk past me from the stairs leading to the platform. I watched as she slowly walked forward. An uncomfortable feeling grew in my stomach. She looked gaunt, her skin grey like she hadn't seen sunlight, or like she was ill. Her cries sent a shiver down my spine as they grew louder. What was wrong with her? I thought to myself. I called out, "Miss, are you okay?" But my question was met with no response. She didn't even look back to acknowledge me. Rather, she continued to walk forward as she cried, edging closer to the edge of the platform. My concern grew as I saw her cross the painted line that was a warning not to step too close to the platform edge. "Miss," I called out again, but again there was no reply. The sound of the train amplified in the distance as it grew closer. As I turned, I could see its beaming lights in the distance as it coursed towards the platform. Turning back to the woman, she was now right on the edge of the platform. My heart began to race as I called out for her to get back. I edged forward towards her, shouting at her to step back from the edge. The train almost upon us and not holding back. In that moment, the woman finally turned, facing me. I stopped in my tracks as our eyes locked. The look in her eyes. There was something not right. Something missing. Not having time to think on that, I moved closer, trying to help her, fearing the worst. But as I took one more step forward, it was then she jumped off the platform, down onto the tracks, out of sight. I was stunned. My adrenaline through the roof as I ran to look down to see her. In the moment, I didn't know what the hell to do. I turned towards the train's beaming headlights as I waved my arms frantically towards it, screaming for it to stop. The sound of it roaring down the tracks deafening. It was not slowing. My cries no match for the roaring engine. Nobody could hear me. Looking back once more, I could see the face of the woman. Tears strolling down her face as she stared up at me. Turning once more, the train rolled into the station. I closed my eyes as I screamed, feeling like I couldn't breathe. The brakes screeched as the train pulled up, the doors opening as a few passengers exited. Looking to the front of the train, I could see the conductor stepping off looking at me. I ran over to him screaming about the woman on the track, telling him what had just happened. His calm response shocked me as he told me to calm down. I couldn't. What the hell did he mean calm down after what I had just seen? Then, What he said next, I'll never forget, and it shook me to the core. He said that there was no one on the tracks, that there was no woman out there. I again told him what I saw. He calmly said, "Sir, there was no one on the tracks. You're not the first person to have seen her." Confused by what he meant, he explained further. There had been many sightings of a woman in grey, crying as she jumped off the ledge in front of a train. What I had seen was a ghost. That years prior a woman distressed had jumped in front of a train on that platform, falling to her death. Since that night, every so often, passengers on this platform alone at night have reported seeing the exact same thing I saw, of the woman jumping to her death, only to find out there was no woman at all. It is said the presence of that woman lingers and haunts the platform, with many believing her soul is not at peace. Hearing what he told me, I couldn't believe what he was saying, but after seeing proof and coming to terms with the fact there was actually no deceased woman on the tracks, and that I had not witnessed a death like I thought, but instead the haunting presence of a ghost, I felt physically sick. I had never encountered anything like that before, nor had I been a person who believed in anything paranormal. But I could not explain in any other way what happened that night. I may not have got the job I wanted, but I got something else instead. A new outlook on the world, and what I now believe in. What happened that night is something that I will never forget, and that woman's face will haunt me forever. My husband got a new job, and with this job, it required us to relocate for work purposes. It was just myself and my husband, so it wasn't too much hassle, and his new job came with a pay rise, so it would benefit us in the long run. The area that we moved to in Chicago was said to be a nice and friendly area, and the house that we had acquired was a size up from what we were previously living in. Spacious, already well decorated, and had been vacant for quite some time since its previous owners had left, so it was a great deal. We moved in pretty quick. With it already being empty, the process was smooth, and less stressful than moving would usually be. Upon our arrival and hiring a moving company, the first few days were pretty much sorting out our belongings and furniture, and getting moved in. I was pretty excited to start this new chapter of our lives in a new house, and couldn't wait to get everything sorted and settle in. One night, after we had recently moved in, I'd say around 3 days of being there, I woke up to some noises coming from the attic. The noises sounded like slight banging and knocking, but repetitive. For a minute or so I listened, and then I woke my husband up to tell him, and so he could hear what I was hearing. Half asleep, obviously, he listened for a minute or two, and then the noise stopped. Unlike me, he didn't seem that bothered. He said to me not to worry, and that it was nothing. The house was old and it was probably old pipes. He claimed that they would tend to make noise when the weight of water passed through them. Or if anything, it could be a squirrel or something up there. If it continued over the next few days, then he'd check it out. After our short discussion, it put me at ease. Thinking nothing more of it, we went back to sleep. The next day was my husband's first official day at his new job, so he was up early. I followed shortly after to make an early start on finishing the rest of the unpacking, and make the place less cluttered and feel more homely. I was sorting through our boxes and putting things away, when I noticed one of the boxes was missing. I'd misplaced a box containing our digital equipment, our camera, camcorder, my old Polaroid that had been in my family for years, and a few other items. All the boxes were labelled, and I definitely couldn't see it anywhere. I didn't want to mention it to my husband, as a lot of his stuff was in there, so I planned to search the basement where we had placed a lot of boxes, before mentioning anything. Plus, I didn't want to bother him on his first day. I did though find it strange, as I could have sworn I'd placed it in the front room. I mentioned to my husband when he got back that I was having trouble finding certain things. He told me he was exhausted and so was I from moving, and that I should relax, there was no rush to sort it all out in our first week, and that everything would turn up at some point. I somewhat agreed and decided to brush it off. I had decided to have a drink that night to see if I could get a better night's sleep, and for the majority it worked. But even with that, in the early hours the same sound I'd heard the night before woke me again. It freaked me out. The It sounded more than just a pipe to me. I woke up my husband, and to his annoyance, he said he would go and check it out if it would put me at ease. We went up to the attic and looked around into the darkness, lighting it up with a flashlight. And there was nothing there. Just some dead junk that would need to be cleared out, my husband said. I was a bit more relieved after that and went back to sleep. However, the night after brought me to the edge. Around 3 a.m. when I got up to go to the toilet, a shudder of fear consumed me, as I swore I saw a figure pass our bedroom door in the hallway. Suddenly awake with adrenaline coursing through my veins, I feared an intruder was in the house. I again woke up my husband, who by now must have been thinking I was crazy and paranoid. We looked around the whole house. There was no one in sight. I wasn't settled this time, half asleep or not. I knew what I saw and my gut was telling me. The next day, when my husband had left for work, and with it being the daytime, I decided to check the attic myself, feeling more comfortable and less scared as I would at night. I grabbed the flashlight and proceeded to go into the attic. As I fully got up there, my husband was right. Pretty empty, with just some leftover junk I take it no one could be bothered to clear. As I explored further into the attic, I noticed a few boards looked out of place towards what looked to be at the back of the attic. I went over to them and saw they were loose. I began to move them, and to my horror, what I uncovered behind there was a crawl space, which was anything but empty. There was a blanket and pillow behind there amongst needles and syringes. Not only that, but the box I thought I'd misplaced days before. My heart began to pound as I couldn't believe what I saw. Polaroids that had recently been taken. Pictures of me around the house unpacking boxes and tidying up. Even worse, pictures of me and my husband showering. The camera was also out. I turned it on and the blood in my veins turned to ice as I played a video that was dated the night before. On the video was darkness, someone shuffling around, and then coming into picture was my bedroom door opening and someone entering our room as me and my husband slept. I felt sick to my stomach as the person with the camera filmed us. They got closer to our bed and were standing right over me as I slept. Zooming in on my face, my skin crawled as on the video a pale, dirty, yellow-nailed hand hovered over my face, so close that it motioned stroking my face, before filming into the mirror and waving at their own sick reflection. They backed up and slowly left the room as the video ended. Tears rolled down my face. I quickly turned around, fearing whoever was on the video was still up there. The worst outcomes running through my head. I had never been so scared. I ran to climb out of the attic as I looked back to an empty, dark hole, half expecting to see a face. I rang the police, then my husband straight away, notifying him. The police arrived and searched the place. No one was there. And the scary thing is, no suspect was ever found, and no one ever returned. The police quickly closed the case. It remains unsolved. They just put it down to the fact the house had been vacant for so long that a squatter might have been living up there before we had moved in. Maybe true, but that was no comfort to me. On that video I only saw the guy's hand, and just from that I knew this was not someone you ever wanted to meet. To be watched in your own house, and knowing some freak was in what you thought was your safe place, you never feel safe again. This happened over a year ago now, and even today I find myself looking over my shoulder.
I had been renting a place with my friend for a few years. It was great, and with having my friend as a roommate, it split the cost down the middle and was easy to cover. Also, having someone you know and get along with as a roommate is the best. So when my friend and his long-term girlfriend decided to move in together, it was a shock at first, as I enjoyed living with him. But then came the realization I needed a new roommate to help cover the cost of living there. I wanted to act fast, as I couldn't keep paying it all on my own. So I used online services to advertise for a roommate. It didn't take long for interest to come in. That's when I met Louise. Louise was 28 years old, Hispanic, who seemed down to earth and was very keen on renting. At the time, he told me he needed to find himself a place urgently for work purposes, so he had no problem paying up front in cash. I wanted to interview a few people interested in the room at first, but when he said he was willing to pay now and cash, that was music to my ears, as there was upcoming payments due. So, wanting the process done myself, I thought, why not? And that's when Louise became my new roommate. The initial moving in period was fast. Louise didn't have a lot of stuff. The first night was fine. Louise seemed to settle in well. I remember asking him the next day how he slept and how his first night was. He said it was great, and he had settled in well. He hadn't had such a good night's sleep in a while. Fair enough, I thought. It was good to hear, and I was just glad that I'd found a roommate to help split the cost. It wasn't until the next night something weird happened. I was sitting watching the TV when Luis came home. He went straight to his room and shut himself in. I remember asking if everything was okay, to which I got a muffled response that everything was fine. He was just tired. Leaving him to it, I went back to watching TV for the rest of the night, until heading to bed myself. It was later that night I woke up to something that had caused me to break my sleep. I checked the time and could see it was near enough 3 a.m. in the morning. I wasn't sure what woke me until I sat there and the silence was broken. I listened to what grabbed my attention, and it was then that I could hear a knocking at my door. It wasn't like someone was knocking my door, but like something was knocking against my door. A thud motion. I didn't know what it was, so I was about to get up to see what it could be when the sound changed. It went from a knocking to a scratching sound towards the bottom of my door. I could then see the outline of movement from the bottom of the door, a shadow moving as the scratching continued. I don't have any pets, nor did Louise, and with only the two of us living there, I thought, what the hell was that? The only thing I could think to do was to call out, as I was too creeped to open the door straight away. As I called out, "Hello?" the scratching slowly stopped, as if it heard me. I called out, "Louise, is that you out there?" I was met with silence for a good half a minute. As I stood up, the sound of thumping began to echo up and down the hallway, as if someone was galloping up and down the hallway past my room. It scared the crap out of me. I moved closer to my door as I placed my hand on the doorknob. The galloping soon stopped, and as I pressed my ear to the door, it was then I heard another door shut to the hallway. Silence then filled the room, as all I could hear was my pulse racing. I slowly opened my door as I poked my head out into the hallway to see it was empty. I looked over at Luis's door as I could see the door handle slowly reaching its original position. That must have been Luis in the hallway, I thought to myself. But what the fuck was he doing, and why was he knocking and scratching at my door? I closed my door, making sure I locked it, and headed back to bed, not really sleeping much after that. The next day when I was making food for work, Luis came into the kitchen saying morning and making conversation. Now, I thought as we were talking, this was the perfect moment to ask him about last night. So I did. Without trying to be blunt, I asked, "Were you outside my bedroom door last night knocking and walking past the door?" I left out the scratching at that time, but I don't know why. He stopped what he was doing as he looked at me, as if shocked, or if I was the weird one, as he said, "No, he wasn't. Why do I ask?" I told him about what I heard outside the door, and he straight up denied it, saying he wasn't quite sure what I was talking about. After the awkward silence filled the room, as I finished making my food, I said goodbye as I headed to work. I questioned myself all day, thinking at first I was dreaming it. But I knew what I heard and saw, and I knew I was awake. I knew the difference between a dream and reality. Later that evening, after arriving back after work, I was again back before Luis. The house was empty. He arrived back shortly after me, and again we had minimal conversation before he headed off to his room. I thought, maybe it was all a one-off and I was overthinking things. Maybe he was a sleepwalker and didn't realize it. I settled in for the night before heading to bed myself at around midnight that night. I made sure my door was locked, hoping it was a one-off. I was wrong again. I was awoken that night to the sound of the same thuds at my door. As I sat up and listened, I couldn't believe it. What the hell was going on? That's when my doorknob started to rattle as if trying to get into my room. I shouted, "Luis, is that you out there? What are you doing?" The rattling suddenly stopped. I sat up as I stared at the door. As I stood to walk over to it, was when I heard a clang in the hallway, followed by the sound of something sliding and creaking, followed by more weird creaking sound in the hallway. I couldn't put up with this, and I had to see what the hell was going on. I slowly opened my door, looking out into the hallway. I saw that Luis's bedroom door was opened, and as I looked up the other side of the hallway, it was then a nervous feeling washed over me. I saw the attic wide open, with the ladder down, as if someone was up in the attic in the pitch black. I slowly stepped into the hallway, as at this point I was freaked out. I looked towards the attic as I looked up, calling Luis's name, asking if he was up there. I got no reply. I looked back at his room. He wasn't in there. I didn't know what the hell was going on. As I stood closer to the ladder, looking up into the pitch black abyss of the attic above me, it was then the silence broke as the floorboards creaked above me. My heart racing, I called out Luis's name again, and again. I was met with a deathly silence. This time I shouted his name, asking what the fuck he was doing. As I leaned closer, there was no way I was going up there. It was then I heard something dripping, as if like the sound of a tap dripping. I noticed something had dripped onto the ladder. I quickly reached for the hallway light as finally light was brought to the room, but to my horror, I saw the red blood-like substance that had been dripping down out of the attic. I looked back up to the attic one more time as I saw a pair of white eyes staring down at me from the darkness. That was enough for me as I bolted back to my room, locking the door as I grabbed my phone, calling the police. I couldn't get my words out fast enough as I told them what was happening, and about roommate, and the seemingly blood coming from the attic. They said dispatch was en route. I heard the sound of clamoring in the hallways as if Luis had descended out of the attic, and I heard him running to his room. Seconds later, the sound of him running through the house and out the front door. I couldn't bring myself to come out of my room straight away, just in case. I waited until the police arrived, and when they did, what we found was not what I expected, but more terrifying than I thought. It wasn't blood I saw dripping from the attic, but red paint. And when Luis's room was searched, to my shock, there were satanic red symbols painted over the walls. As the police checked the attic, it was the same up there, and it seemed he had begun to paint symbols on the floor of the attic. I have no idea what he was doing, but it was clearly something satanic, and I truly believe he had planned to have me be a part of whatever he was doing. I'm lucky I woke up and caught him when I did. I couldn't give the police much to go by, as I didn't know where Luis came from before he roomed with me. All I had was his name, and I hadn't done my job properly and done the correct procedure and background check. Letting him pay cash to get a quick roommate in was my own fault, a mistake I will never make again. That night will always haunt me. I never saw Luis after that, and the police never pursued the case. I soon moved out of that place myself, moving to a cheaper place and somewhere I felt I didn't have to sleep with one eye open. So, if you're considering getting a roommate, make sure you go through the correct procedures and know who you're inviting into your home.
I have a story for you, but I'd like to remain anonymous. This all took place back in 2022. I applied for a remote proofreading job via LinkedIn with a known company, or at least I thought it was. I was contacted via email by a gentleman named Alex to find out my availability for the interview. I interviewed over Skype, then with Marlon, which was a series of questions. I never actually talked to him. This should have been the first red flag, I know. Marlon advised me several minutes after submitting my answers to the review team that I was hired. I completed a 1099 with my name and address only, and signed the contract. I was then advised I needed to have a check sent to me, which I would sign and deposit into my account, then use the funds towards a workstation needed for the job and pay a vendor with it All of this sounded kind of weird, but they used a lot of buzzwords that were just exactly what I wanted to hear in the moment. Signing a check, sending me cash in advance, paying a vendor, buying all my own equipment. I know it all sounds scammy, but at the moment, I was a guy looking for a job. They were a company willing to send me several $1,000s as well to hire me. What kind of scam involves sending me money directly first? I couldn't think of one, so I just considered myself very lucky, fortunate to have such a cool opportunity before me. But alas, here I am, submitting my own personal horror story. The $3,000 check from the company showed as available in my personal checking account right away, so I relied on the bank to see what the funds were available and thought they could be used. I was asked by the vendor, whose name was Kim, via text to make payments in increments to equal the $3,000. 2 were made through Zelle in the amount of $500, each to an individual, then 1 through Venmo in the amount of $1,000 to another individual. I did not know either of them personally. I know what you're all thinking. How could you be so stupid? This was money that simply appeared in my account. I thought this was simply some kind of protocol for the company to get me integrated. Everything seemed official, and there was company money in my account, or so I thought. So it all seemed very legitimate. And on top of all of that, when someone hands you money with instructions, you simply do what you're told. Otherwise, it's theft. Know what I mean? Once the money showed up, I felt like I was on the hook. Otherwise, I'd be in some form of trouble. I knew the money from the $3,000 check was not my own, but I thought I could pay the remainder of what was due to the vendor from that check and still have existing funds that were already in my account. If I knew the funds were not yet available, I would have never made any further transaction. This all took place over Labor Day weekend in 2022. So what happened is this. Because that money was so new to my account, it was technically still pending. So all the funds that I paid from my account were actually my own cash, not from the $3,000 that was holding. All good, I just figured I'd do a swap and let the new cash fill in more what I was shelling out for my savings. I received a call from the bank the day after Labor Day, advising me that the check was fraudulent. There was no hold place on the check. In the meantime, my checking account balance had gone into the negative. I was advised by them not to communicate with any of the individuals involved, and to immediately file a police report, which I did that day. The $3,000 was now null and void, and on top of that, I'd sent out every dime that I had to these vendors and then some. This was turning into a dark, hopeless situation. I received an email from Alex and a text from Kim about sending the rest of the funds, and the workstation to be shipped to my home address. Needless to say, I did not respond to their request, nor did I hear from them again. I kept all the correspondence and filed reports with several agencies. I'm employed full-time and was in the midst of trying to earn some additional income during some hard times, particularly while COVID was still rampant. I failed to recognize the signs of a scam and was caught in a weak moment because of the day of my interview. I was late to my grandmother's birthday. So I took my new hire as a good sign. It made me sick to be taken so advantage of by people from this seedy side of the web, especially when I'm just trying to do right by my family in a world without a lot of work. My wife and I are a one-income household. She is disabled, still in the process of applying for federal benefits. I was trying to do what I could to make ends meet. This really hurt us. The whole situation still has us very upset. It makes me feel especially like a failure after all this time. I need to reach out to 988 as the situation has been very traumatizing. I also had taken some time off from my job after it took place. I have anxiety and depression for which I'm treated, which obviously had worsened since this event occurred. For people that this has happened to, there is no form of relief, only brutal, blistering shame. All we can do is hide it. God forbid someone find out that I've been swindled, and then I have to explain that I'm both naive and penniless. The agencies that I filed the report with either did not contact me back or they were unable to help me. I was beyond defeated and had very dark thoughts after this realization. I really only saw one way out. Thankfully, I was brought back to my senses and have then just done my best to deal with the situation itself. I followed up with the police and they were really unable to do anything further for me. Just continued to advise me that I need to contact Attorney General's office, which I had already done that. I tried working with my bank, but they informed me that since Venmo and Zelle activity was initiated and authorized by me, the dispute claims for both were denied. Evidently, there's some kind of regulation known as Reg E that does not provide protection for consumers in the event of authorized payments resulting from scams. Therefore, I'm shit out of luck. As far as I know, the Skype account, the Venmo account, and the Zelle account for all those individuals involved are still active. There's something especially damning about that, how no one saw any consequences but me. These people didn't lose any sleep, didn't have to run or vanish. They still use the same accounts to pull their scams. It blows my mind that there are agencies and law enforcement and tons of paper trails and evidence to back everything up. Still, they are powerless to do anything. What kind of world do we live in where people can do this in broad daylight and never ever get caught? I do not know all the steps that the police took with this issue, what protocols were followed, or if they just concluded this likely occurred overseas, as the officer who was assigned to my case had mentioned to me. I realized this situation is not as big as many of the other issues the police encounter, but I was hoping a more thorough investigation would have been concluded. Scammers therefore continue to get away with their misdeeds. I understand that there was no unauthorized activity in my accounts, and that I initiated these payments. However, I never would have done so if I knew these were fraudsters and part of some giant scam. Electronically, the funds showed up as available on my mobile app, which is misleading. If I knew they were unavailable, it would have delayed me from making any transactions until I heard back from my bank and that the check was fraudulent. I paid a heavy price for it against my better judgment, since I'm out $2,000. I've since taken additional measures and am much more cautious when applying for and researching online jobs. I was able to since find a stable and legitimate part-time position, get back on track with my life for the most part. I'd be lying if I told you this whole issue doesn't haunt me still, whenever I think about it. I've never had anything like this happen to me before. Nothing that at least doesn't involve money being sent and stolen from me. What a creative way to bleed accounts dry. All of this was digital crime, all online of course. But there was one night in the thick of it that something happened in real life. It was after I learned the whole thing was a scam, but right before I made that official report. It was a late night for my wife and I, and even as she turned in for bed, I found I couldn't fall asleep. I toddled from the bedroom to the living room into the office before settling in a chair and just staring up at the ceiling. Just trying to clear my mind in the dead of night. And that's when I thought I heard a knock at the door. I looked down and waited. Nothing came again. I figured I was just hearing things, a symptom of my distressed state of mind. It did, however, spook me enough to bring me back to the real world, at which point I got myself together and went to bed. It wasn't until the next morning when I went outside for my morning coffee that I found a letter taped to my front door. Very unusual for my house. Unusual for my neighborhood, and with the current situation going on, I was very careful. I removed that letter carefully, brought it inside, and called the investigator handling my case for further instruction. He told me to wait, and it needed to go into evidence. They did whatever they do and yielded no results. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing, just a bare white envelope with a letter in it. When we opened it up, all it said was thanks, in printed letters. To this day, I have no idea if it was related, but the timing was impeccable. The cleanliness of the letter and envelope were also suspicious. Either way, it garnered no leads and just went into the evidence pile. The scariest part was that perhaps somebody knew where I lived. even knew that I was awake that one night. It made me wonder how compromised all my devices were. To this day, nobody was ever caught and probably never will be. You can all add insult to injury, but trust me, I've heard it a lot since this happened and I wish it never did. I wanted to share my story because I don't want to see what happened to me happen to anybody else.
When I was in my early teens, an event happened to me and my family that firmly made me a believer in the paranormal. It's something that terrified me and has always stuck with me. Now, I'm not here to convince anyone otherwise from what they believe. I'm just sharing my story and the experience I had. It happened when I was 14. I'm from the UK and my family had just moved into a new house. We'd moved locations for my dad's work purposes, and the house that we'd moved into was an old Victorian house. These types of houses were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The house itself was big and spacious and beautiful to look at. After we had moved in, it was nice to have a bigger bedroom and have some space for my younger brother. The first week went by quick. It was tiring sorting out all our belongings and my parents occupied with decorating. It was then it happened. One night I was home with my dad. My mother was out shopping with my brother at the time. I had been reading a book out back in the conservatory, and having finished, I decided to head upstairs to my room. Heading to my room, I had to walk through the rest of the house, as allowed was the conservatory out back, the hallway past the kitchen, then you would turn a corner to the stairs and living room. As I walked back, I passed the kitchen where I could hear the kettle boiling. Quickly glancing inside, I could see the cupboard was open, and my dad inside probably looking for a mug. Continuing my journey, en route to my room, I turned the corner to head upstairs, and that's when I froze. As I looked into the living room, the TV was on, and sat in front of it, in his chair, was my dad. Confused, I looked at him as he stared back at me smiling. I looked back at the kitchen, thinking how did he get past me without me seeing? There was only one way to the living room from the kitchen. He could obviously see the startled look on my face as he asked if I was okay. So I asked him, how did he get from the kitchen so fast? He looked at me confused as he told me he hadn't been in the kitchen. Telling him I just saw him making a drink in the kitchen. He again looked at me weird, saying he hadn't made a drink. Then it hit me. If it wasn't my dad, and my mother and brother were out, then who was that standing in our kitchen boiling the kettle? Freaked, I ran back to the kitchen as I looked inside to find it was empty. The cupboard was closed and there was no sign of anyone. Calling my dad, he soon came to the kitchen. As I told him I swore I had just seen someone in the kitchen that I thought was him. Freaked out, I told him the kettle was boiling and someone was reaching for a mug in the cupboard. My dad, seeing how freaked out I was, looked around the house for any sign of an intruder, but there was no one. When we checked over the kitchen, the kettle was hot, proving my point it had just been boiled by someone. My dad brushing it off, telling me it could have held the heat from earlier that evening, and that if it wasn't me or him, then that must be the case as no one else turned it on. I didn't buy that. Convinced of what I saw, I was sure I had seen someone in our kitchen. But my dad assuring me that everywhere had been checked and there was no one else in the house. I began to question myself, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. Later that night, as I lay in bed, fast asleep, I awoke to the chilling sounds of someone screaming. As I shot up in my bed, my heart was racing. The sounds of the scream had woke me. I looked at the time and it had just gone 2 a.m. Hearing my dad's voice in the hallway shouting, asking if everything was okay as he ran from his room, shouting my mum's name. I soon followed him as I opened my door looking into the hallway to see my mum running up the stairs towards my dad and my brother peering out of his room looking scared. My mum looked white as a sheet, and as she tried to compose herself, what she said next terrified me. She said she had got up to go to the bathroom, and as she walked across the landing she could see a glow coming from downstairs. Curious as to what it was, she went to check it out. When she located the light, she could see that the glow was coming from the fridge that was wide open. thinking one of us the culprit, and hadn't shut the door properly. She walked over to close it. But it's what happened next that terrified her. As she closed the fridge door, it was then she felt a breath down her neck, and as she looked to the side in the reflection of the window, she could see a man standing right behind her. That is when she turned, screaming to the sight of no one. There was no one in the room, but the figure she saw in the reflection was clear as day. My dad investigating again and found no sign of anyone. It was only us in the house. He suggested she had got up still half asleep and tired and her brain was just playing tricks on her. But knowing my mum, I had never seen her so shook up. After that night, as the days passed, things gradually got worse. My parents began to fight all the time. Strange things kept happening around the house. I would feel like I would see the figure of a man out the corner of my eye, and the whole atmosphere just felt wrong. Like we weren't the same happy family as we were. We were all unhappy and our mood had changed. Then, the final straw came one evening, when my mum caught my brother talking aloud on his own. When she asked him what he was doing, he said, "Talking to the man in grey." When she asked what man, his response sent a chill down her spine. "The man standing behind you," he told her. Hearing this, it hit her like a punch to the gut. She turned to see nothing, no one. But as she stared, she could feel it. An uncomfortable feeling. Like she was being watched. It was then she knew we were not alone. There was some kind of evil presence festering in the house, around our family. That night, my mum got her wish. She told my dad we needed to move and leave that house. And soon after, we were out of there, staying with family until we started renting somewhere new. After we left that house, it was like a dark cloud had been lifted. Our moods all of a sudden changed. We felt like our usual selves again, and the strange occurrences stopped. That confirmed it for me. I fully believe there was a negative force lingering in that house. From what I saw and felt and what I experienced, I know that that house contained a paranormal presence. I look back to that time of my life, and I know what I saw. And what we all felt was real, and whatever it was, did not want us there. I was driving home from working out of town when this experience happened to me. I'd been on the road for hours and still had a ways of my journey to go. I wasn't due back until late that evening. I was driving down a long stretch of road when I saw up ahead someone walking on the side of the road. Slowing, I could see they were facing me as they signaled look for me to stop. The man was alone and there was no other vehicle in sight, so wondering what he was doing out here walking the side of the road, I stopped. I wound the window down, checking if he was okay. He was, I would say, looking to be in his mid-30s and of Latino descent. A smile plastered itself across his face, seemingly happy I'd stopped. He asked me if he could trouble me for a ride as he was stranded and could really use the help. Looking at this guy, he seemed genuine, so not thinking twice, I said I would give him a ride. As he jumped in, he thanked me and seemed genuinely happy that I'd stopped and that I'd given him a ride. Hey, I'd been driving for hours, so I thought I could use some company anyway, someone to talk to. As we discussed where he was heading, it seemed it would be on my way to where I was heading, so it wasn't any problem. As we drove, we chatted, and the man was friendly enough. He said his name was Dominic and that he'd been hitchhiking for hours before I'd finally stopped and helped him out. He'd fallen out with his partner, who had drove off without him, leaving him stranded. I thought to myself, obviously not knowing the full context, that it was a pretty shitty thing to do. After discussing him, Dominic began to ask where I was coming from, where I was heading, and what I did for a living, amongst other things. As I was answering, I noticed Dominic was disengaged, not really listening to what I was saying, and was more concentrated on looking out the rear view and side mirror. I jokingly asked if he was looking for something, but as I asked, he just looked at me and laughed. Strange, I thought to myself. It was then his phone began to ring as he answered. He began talking in Spanish. something I wasn't very well versed in, so I couldn't understand what he was saying. But as he continued to talk, he kept looking at me as he smiled. I began to feel uncomfortable as I got the impression that he was talking about me. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed that way. He continued in his own language as he laughed. For someone who had just been left stranded by their partner after an argument, he sure did seem in good spirits. I continued to drive as I fell silent, listening in on his conversation. I couldn't understand as he continued to stare at me, making me feel uncomfortable. It was then he said something that I understood. He mentioned the make of my car to whoever was on the phone, before hanging up. Why had he mentioned the make of the car I was driving? The car then fell silent, as he looked out the window, then back down at his phone. Something didn't seem quite normal about this guy now. I asked him if everything was alright, to which he replied yes. He was just talking to a friend, as he then began to speak aloud in his own language again. It was then I said, "English if you can please," and that I didn't speak Spanish. He looked at me and then proceeded to laugh as he apologized. He was just thinking out loud. His eyes then moved back to the mirror. What was he looking for? In that moment, as I looked up in the rearview mirror, it was then I saw a set of headlights turn on and head onto the road behind us. As soon as that happened, Dominic looked at his phone and said where I was dropping him off was coming up soon, and he directed me where to turn off a few miles or so up ahead. We were nowhere near where he had originally said he wanted to be dropped. I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling building in my gut, as I knew something wasn't right. The car behind was pretty much tailgating us now. As I drove and my thoughts raced, I noticed Dominic, who was trying not to make it obvious, glance in the mirror at the car behind before looking back at me. Not knowing what to do, I said, "So where was it you needed dropping?" He calmly replied, "Just a little way up." And at that point, with the car behind and his strange behavior, I knew to trust my gut something was not right. I saw a gas station up ahead and knew that was my best and only option to try and get myself out of this situation I found myself in. The car was definitely following us. I didn't want to make it too obvious, so waiting until the last second, I quickly turned off towards the gas station. The guy's face changed suddenly as he began speaking in his own language again, before angrily asking me what I was doing and where I was going. I said I needed to get gas before we went any further. He seemed pissed as he told me I didn't and to get back onto the road. I told him it was okay, he could wait in the car, I would only be a second. Then my heart began to race as he began to rummage in his pocket as if looking for something. I knew this wasn't a good sign. Finally, in the view of public, I came to an abrupt stop, turned off the car and jumped out. It was then the hitchhiker got out of the car, glaring at me angrily as he hurled words towards me that I couldn't understand. I quickly made my way to the doors of the station, as to be in sight of people. It was then the car that tailgated us pulled up behind my car, as the hitchhiker quickly jumped in before the car sped away. My pulse was racing, I was shaking from adrenaline. I knew something was up and that the hitchhiker had lied to me and was baiting me into a dangerous situation. I don't know where he was leading me or what him and the car following us his true intentions were, but I know it wasn't good, and I'm so glad that I trusted my gut and turned off to a public area. I waited at the gas station for a while and informed the staff of what I believed happened before leaving when I felt safe to do so. After that night, I've never stopped to pick up another hitchhiker. I consider myself lucky nothing happened to me that night. I was so lucky there was a gas station we passed. I don't know what would have happened if there wasn't. So, learning my lesson, I don't want to ever put myself in a situation like that again. Hey guys, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this chilling compilation of haunting stories. We just want to shout out the amazing Danny Dreadful and Booze and Booze for helping out with this one, and bringing life to these creepy encounters. Thank you both. Go and check them out if you haven't already. You won't be disappointed. Let us know in the comments what story creeps you out the most. Oh, and just a quick one guys. We see a lot of you joining us and not yet subscribed. If you're enjoying the content, come join us over in our dark corner of the world, and hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate it, and enjoy growing the Horror Motives community. Thanks again, and until the next video, remember, fear lies within.